I'll say this about Vietnam. I got over there. I was a Division A liaison officer with a Vietnamese infantry division, the 5th Army Infantry Division, and I was a attack fighter pilot. All of my people that came to be my forward air controllers were what we call Class B FAC. They were not attack fighter pilots. They sent me blue ribbon people, the finest people you want to meet. And I was just very fortunate in my year there that I had these wonderful people working for me.
We typhooned back to NKP, and they brought us back. And Mike and I are flying back in an OV-10, and the winds at Da Nang are out of limits for the airplane. And I'm thinking, why are we bringing us back at this point? So we're trying to figure out how to get the airplane on the ground. And there were several attempts before we finally got on the ground, and I think Mike was a little concerned that he had this dumb lieutenant that was trying to either plaster him all over the concrete or get him to jump out of an airplane in winds beyond limits to do that sort of thing. And we had an interesting day, but the way it came about was last night he says, who was I with that day? Because he didn't remember. And I'm going, me, I think I was the guy. End of story.
There we go. Check out that nice hat.
Okay, I'm getting ready for a mission, and a guy comes out in a blue uniform, and he's a information officer from the Air Force Information Office. Okay, I said, how often do you fly? Are you in a little? He said, big airplanes. I've never flown in a little airplane. I said, oh boy. So I give him 3 barf bags, right? 3 barf bags. Okay, and then he goes back in and he gets his suit on, and his radios, and they brief him, The next day he comes back out and we go fly. And he actually had a flight suit. I don't know where he got the flight suit. It didn't have anything on it. But, he's in the back seat. And I don't have anything planned. Okay, I had no pre-planned targets, nothing, so be real nice. That's why they picked me. I'm just going to go, Well, we get up and we get airborne. About a half hour after we get airborne, we're going, wom, 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 wom. And they say, Helix, troops in contact. I said, whoops. Power throttles to the ball, to the wall, and away we go. And I had troops in contact. And they were getting shot at, and a couple of guys got wounded, and they wanted to get a dust-off in, and so I come roaring up there. And the guy in the back says, what's happening? And I said, well, it's going to get a little busy, a little busy. Don't touch anything and just hang on, And he was all right until I rolled in for the first mark. And I hear this, wah, as I roll in for the first mark and shoot off a rocket, I said, I'm sorry, I'm busy, and I'm pulling off, I can't help you now. And then the fighters came in and they dropped bombs and that stuff. And I go in for the second one, and I wonder if he's going to barf on this one, And he doesn't. He's fine, And as we pulled off, they shot like crazy at us, And he said, what are the little sparkles down there? I said, they're shooting at us. And he said, barf. And he's the information officer, right? So he saved 1 barf bag. And we went home, and that was the end of that.
Do you know Ray Butler?
No. I saw him here today.
He used to be a flight lieutenant in the Royal Australian Air Force.
Okay.
So he was driving a Jeep one night. My friend Jerry Hall was in this with me, so he can verify the whole story. We had 8 people in the Jeep, and the rule was you couldn't drive with more than 4. Our 8th guy was sitting on the canvas roof. So the air police Jeep at Benoit starts to chase us. And, of course, he was an ex-fighter pilot, so nobody's getting on his 6 o'clock. So we raced into the parking lot at the Hooch there at Benoit. We're doing donuts with a cop Jeep spinning with us. Everybody bails out. Big Al Door falls off the roof into the dark. Big Al the kitty's pal. So he falls off in the dark. He was a major, but his oak leaves were kind of dirty. So
like a colonel.
The sergeant was a very black sergeant from Georgia, speaking with a very heavy southern accent to Butler, who's returning his speech in Australia. Neither one understands the other. And out of the dark comes Big Al, the kitty's pal. He says, "I'm Colonel Dorr. What's the problem?"
Yeah, who fell off the top, right?
So the sergeant is explaining, we were chasing this man at 50 miles an hour. He's trying to evade, escape. He had 8 men in the car. I'm the only one left with him. And there was a guy sitting on the roof. And the colonel says, "We'll take care of this. We'll take care of this. We can't have an international, incident. He's Australian. He's not an American. So I'll take care of this. Thank you very much." He rips up the ticket.
And he says, "It's nice to see a sober officer now, right?"
The cop says, "Nice to see a sober officer amongst the crew." That's Ray Butler.
Have you heard about the oversex robot? He pulled himself to pieces. I took this guy over here, Jerry Hall. We were FACs at Benoit together. And I snuck him on an Australian C-130 to go down for a week's R&R on Penang Island in Malaysia, where I was based before I went to Vietnam. And the colonel was a bit worried about us being together on Penang Island because he thought we'd get into a bit of trouble and probably a bit of ruckus and get into a barroom brawl or something like that. But that didn't happen. We got down there to Penang Island and I met some friends and had to go out. So I left him in the hands of some of my buddies that were in the fighter squadron down in Penang in Malaysia, at Butterworth. And they took him out on the Saturday night on a motorbike, and they were all drunk. So they decided they'd drag race this motorbike down the main road of Penang Island. They couldn't make the roundabout at the end. They hit it at 60 miles an hour. He went up in the 20 feet in the air, landed on his head, broke his arm, nearly lost an eye, cut all his head open. They took him to hospital on Penang, and he tried to get onto the nurses. This is at 1 a.m. And he said, "I need another beer." So he left the hospital, refused treatment. The next morning I'm back at the base, and the young blokes that were with him are telling me about this at breakfast. So I went round to his room, and he's lying in his bed. I thought he was dead. The bed's covered in blood. So I called an ambulance, took him to hospital, patched him up, took him back to Vietnam. He had his arm in plaster. It was broken. He was on crutches. His leg was all taped up. His head was taped up, and his eye had a patch on. The colonel met us at Benoit, and he refused to believe that we weren't in a barroom brawl. And to this day, he still refuses to believe that. But he got more injured on R&R than he ever did in a year in Vietnam. That's my story.
There were 4 Australian nurses there, 4 Australian doctors.
Where were you?
Long Xuyen on the Ba Sac River. And I helped organize a Halloween party. We had one of those big Vietnamese crocs, and I had my O1. I could fly around and buy the liquor. We filled this thing up, about 40 gallons of all kind of booze. And what we decided to do, we were going to take a Vietnamese and dress him up like a corpse. Where they had these Australian nurses, and they wrapped this guy up about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Before that, I went with a Vietnamese down to the town, and I wanted to know if I could buy a casket. And the Vietnamese said, "You want to buy a casket?" Yes. Once we established that we were going to buy a casket, then we asked him if we could rent a casket from him, and he couldn't figure out how we would. But we wrapped this Vietnamese sergeant up in gauze and ketchup and put him in a casket in this big room that we had full of booze with all the big crock full of stuff, and he was supposed to come out at midnight. He was in there from about 5 o'clock in the afternoon to midnight with a blanket over it. Everybody's sitting on it. At midnight, we tapped on the thing. He came out, and we didn't instruct him at all as to what to do. He came out of there and acted like a ghost, and given all these weird sounds and all this ketchup all over him. 2 of the girls, one of the side girl Vietnamese and one of the Australian nurses, fainted because all the Australian nurses didn't know what was going on. There's only about 2 or 3 of us who knew the story, but that was a hell of an evening, I can tell you that. And one Australian doctor was hung over for 3 days, at least. But it was a real party.
The only thing that I haven't heard in the last day or two is how rewarding it was to save all these GIs on the ground and friends I live with by the application of air power. And it was one of the highlights of my life. And you live with these guys, and so when they're in trouble on the ground, you do anything and everything you can to save them. And it's the most rewarding thing I've ever done. Thank you.
This is George, and he's coming to his first meetings whatsoever, and he's a Raven, and he's never been to a Raven reunion. So we were telling him about belonging to the American Legion. We all belong to American Legion Post Number 1, which is in Shanghai, China, operating in exile since 1948. We're the only post that's worldwide, and it's the Soldier of Fortune post. On the back of Jim Stanford's party suit over there, you'll see one of our logos. There's a lot of people in this organization that belong to Post 1.
My name is Warren McGowan. I was one of the designers of the OV-10. And my association has been with the FAC organization as well as the OV-10 Bronco Association. And the one thing I cannot believe is how these flyers love this plane. As I just thrilled. Thank you.
Sign was Mike 57. I flew out of BAMI 2 East for the MACV Studies and Observation Group. And until 1986, I wasn't allowed to tell anyone what I did, but now you can have the whole story if you'd like to know.
I'm flying over Laos with my forward air navigator, and we're over Ashaw Valley, and he's tracking something on the ground, and we went to get some air to go after it, and it was a couple F-4s showed up, and I'm ready to go after this vehicle he'd seen on the ground. Well, what happened was, all of my rockets were, I didn't have any rockets left, and so I was dropping flares, and they were all duds. So now it was time to try rockets in the black of the night and see if these F-4s could see the rocket plumes, the white phosphorus. And I did a standard delivery for these rockets where I kind of pulled up and then pulled over, and then I was telling the fighters that I'm going to fire off my marking rockets. And I pulled the trigger on them, and as soon as they lit up in the rocket pods, right where I was looking, where that target was, lit up. And pretty soon I was engulfed in sheets of tracers and explosions. And I don't know if it was training or luck, but anyway, I did a split S maneuver and dove straight for the ground in the black of the night until the cockpit wasn't red anymore from the tracers and the explosions. And I'm thinking as I'm diving down, I'm thinking, oh, gee, gyros tumble when you do violent maneuvers, and if these gyros don't work, I'm toast. So I'm on the gyros, and I'm doing an instrument pullout from an Immelmann in the dark of the night, and I noticed that I was at about 1,500 feet as I'm zooming at, I think it was 270 knots in an O2, which is way over speed. And I blacked myself out pulling out because now I'm thinking, oh, I might hit the ground. And I pulled until I thought I might be headed somewhere pretty well straight up. And I let go of the pressure so I could see my instruments. And sure enough, the airspeed was unwinding like this. And I kind of fell off on a wing, hoping I wasn't going to stall and kill myself in my nav anyway. Meanwhile, my voice had risen about 5 octaves, and I'm yelling at the fighters to go after whatever that was. And they said, what? I didn't see anything. And I thought, oh, they don't want to do this. And actually, if you're a fighter, you don't want to point your nose at something like that. So anyway, it was the talk of the area on the radios for a while, and I was very excited, and I went back to Da Nang, and I talked to the Intel people, and they said, based on what you're telling us, it was a quad-mounted 23-millimeter radar-guided, and you're lucky to be alive. And I said, wow, yeah, I guess. And he went over to his archive where he had all his Intel pictures, and sure enough, he had a picture of this, what looked like a tank with 4 guns, pretty big guns, mounted on it, and a radar system. The sequel to the story is I went up there a couple of days later to the place where I did that maneuver. And as it turned out, when I dished out of the maneuver on the bottom at 1,500 feet, I was in a valley, or I wouldn't be doing this tape. So I felt pretty lucky. And